The papers made almost no sound when Miles Hargrove pushed them across the table. No argument, no sharp breath, no last attempt to change the outcome. He uncapped the pen, signed his name in the space they had marked with a small yellow arrow, and set it down the way you set down something you've been carrying too long. Across the table, his wife Fiona did not move to take the papers right away. She let them sit there, let him feel the distance between where he sat and where she had already arrived. She had been arriving somewhere else for a long time. Miles had understood that the way you understand weather before it turns. Something in the air changes, and even when the sky is still clear. Her attorney gathered the documents with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times and felt nothing about it. Fiona's hands were folded in her lap. Her posture was composed, almost gentle. She was 39 and had spent the last 4 years becoming someone who could fill a room without raising her voice. And she had learned to wear composure the way other people wore jewelry, deliberately, for effect. Miles left the conference room with a canvas duffel slung over one shoulder and his 7-year-old daughter asleep against the other. Maisie's fingers were curled into the collar of his jacket, the way they always were when she slept on him. Trusting and complete, unaware of the papers or the room, or any of it. Everyone in that building who watched them go believed they had just witnessed a man lose everything. They were not wrong about what they saw. They were only wrong about what it meant. The story did not begin in that conference room. It began 3 years earlier in a city that barely slept, in the 3rd bedroom of a rented townhouse in Charlotte, North Carolina, where a child's drawings were taped to the wall and a folding table served as a desk. Miles worked there after 9 o'clock most nights, after the dishes were done and the bath had been drawn, and the particular specific ritual of Maisie's bedtime had been completed. Every step in the right order, because that was what she needed, and what she needed was what mattered most. He was 41, a structural engineer by training and by instinct, a man who understood load-bearing things and the quiet catastrophes that happened when you ignored the stress points in a foundation. For the first decade of his career, he had worked for a mid-sized firm that did commercial projects across the Southeast. He had been good at the work and he had liked the work, and then Maisie arrived and the math of his life changed in a way that was not arithmetic but something closer to physics. Everything reorganized around a small center of gravity. He scaled back. He took fewer site visits. He stopped chasing the projects that required weeks in other cities. Fiona's career was climbing at the time, a regional director role with a commercial real estate group, and it made sense that Miles would be the one to be there when the school called, to arrange the pediatrician visits and learn the names of the teachers and know which of Maisie's friends was kind and which one sometimes wasn't. That arrangement had a logic to it, and Miles had accepted the logic without resentment, because the center of gravity made the rest of it feel small by comparison. But he did not stop thinking. That was the thing no one in the conference room had counted on. 3 years earlier, working on a routine inspection of a prefabricated structure that had developed stress fractures in all the wrong places. Miles had become preoccupied with a problem that commercial construction had been circling for decades without solving cleanly. The prefab industry was growing faster than its quality controls could follow, and the diagnostic tools available to engineers in the field were expensive, slow, and built for conditions that didn't match what people actually encountered on a job site. Miles began working on something different. A platform, a software system designed to synthesize real-time structural data from sensor arrays and give engineers something they had never had before, an accurate, immediate, field-deployable analysis without the need for centralized lab processing. He worked on it the way he did most things, without announcement. At the folding table after 9, after Maisie was asleep, after the house had gone quiet enough that he could hear himself think. He used the small inheritance his mother had left him, kept in an account that bore only his name, to purchase the servers and the licenses and the specialized sensor equipment he needed to build the first working prototype. He filed the intellectual property in his own name. He told himself it was simple organization. He went back to work, Fiona never asked what he was doing in the third bedroom. There had been a time, early in their marriage, when she might have, but that time had thinned the way things do when two people are moving fast in different directions and calling it partnership. He did not blame her for not asking. He understood her the way you understand someone you have lived beside for a long time. She was sharp and ambitious, and she experienced the world as a series of advantages to be won or lost. She had married Miles when they were young and unhurried, and somewhere in the years between then and now, she had begun to experience him as a kind of ceiling on what was possible for her. The husband who left the conference calls early, the man who could not be counted on for the dinner with clients, because Maisie's bedtime was not negotiable. She did not say these things directly, but they were present in every conversation they didn't have. The night she told him she wanted a divorce, she came home from an event Miles had skipped to read Maisie a chapter book about a girl who traveled by hot air balloon. Fiona set her bag on the counter, and her voice, when she spoke, was measured and clear, not unkind but not warm. She had already spoken to an attorney. She thought it was best not to drag things out. They wanted different things. She was sorry. Miles stood at the kitchen counter and felt the words settle. He was not surprised. That was the strangest part. He had felt this arriving the way you feel a structural failure beginning, not all at once but incrementally, each small sign dismissed until the pattern became undeniable. What surprised him came 2 days later, in the proposal her attorney delivered. Fiona wanted primary custody of Maisie. She wanted the house. She wanted the shared accounts. Miles was offered scheduled weekends, twice a month, and a list of terms that had been constructed with the quiet efficiency of someone who had thought it through a long time before saying anything out loud. The argument was framed without heat. Miles had left full-time employment 3 years ago. His consulting income was inconsistent and unverifiable in the way that mattered to a court. There was no fixed contract, no stable employer, no record of reliable earnings that a judge could assess against the needs of a 7-year-old child. A man in that position, the proposal implied with careful gentleness, might not be the most appropriate primary caregiver. The offer of twice-monthly weekends was presented as generous. He read it at the kitchen table while Maisie sat on the floor behind him, doing something elaborate with colored pencils, narrating a story out loud to herself the way she always did, a running commentary on a world only she could fully see. He read it again, and then he set it down and looked at his daughter's hands, small and deliberate, pressing down on a purple pencil to make something that mattered to her. On paper, they were right. That was what made it so clean. The invisible work he had done for 3 years left no trail a court could weigh. A father who drove the carpool and knew the pediatrician's name and could identify every one of Maisie's stuffed animals by sight. Those things did not show up in documents. They were not evidence of anything that a legal argument could use. He understood, sitting there, what the easy road looked like. He had seen men take it. Sign the papers, take the weekends, absorb the loss. There was a kind of peace in it, the peace of a man who decides that the fight will cost more than the outcome is worth. Then Maisie came to him that night, the way she sometimes did when she couldn't sleep, and climbed up onto the edge of his bed in the dark, and put her arms around him the way she did, without self-consciousness, completely trusting. "Daddy," she said into his shoulder. Her voice was soft and serious in the way of children who have not yet learned to make their serious questions sound casual. "Are you always going to be here, even when I'm bigger?" Miles held on to her and felt the question settle somewhere beneath his ribs. She was not asking about the divorce. She was 7. She was asking something older than that, something that children ask when they are paying attention to something they sense but cannot name. "Yes," he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "I'm always going to be here. I promise you that." He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after her breathing evened out, and the small weight of her shifted into sleep. Somewhere on the other side of a city, an attorney was assembling paperwork that would reduce his relationship with his daughter to 2 weekends a month and call that fatherhood. He had made her a promise. He was going to need to be able to keep it. The attorney whose name came back to him from 3 different people was a woman in Raleigh named Beverly Crane. People who had worked against her described her in one phrase, delivered quietly: the way you mention something you respect and slightly fear. She is extremely thorough. Miles called from the parking lot of Maisie's school after drop-off, the engine running, the morning light flat and gray through the windshield. The call connected. Crane. A woman's voice, economical, giving nothing away. "My name is Miles Hargrove," he said. "My wife has filed for divorce, and she's asked for primary custody of my daughter. I need someone who isn't going to be impressed by the fact that her attorney's office has more floors than mine does." A brief pause. The kind that meant someone was listening carefully. "Tell me what you've been doing for the last 3 years, Beverly said. "Not what you plan to do, what you actually did." So he told her. He came in the next morning with everything: the bank statements from the separate account, the receipts for the servers and the sensor equipment, the intellectual property registration. A timeline of every night he had worked, documented by the timestamps on his saved files, a record that stretched back 37 months without a significant gap. Beverly read through it with her reading glasses on, and her expression unchanged. "Set the documents, engineer." When she set the documents down, she looked at him with the patience of someone who had spent 20 years watching people bring her problems and had learned to see the load-bearing elements. "In North Carolina," she said, "equitable distribution doesn't presume a 50-50 split the way community property states do, but the court will look hard at what you built and when and how. What you've just shown me is significant. Separate funds, separate account, separate registration. The fact that you filed the IP in your name from the beginning, that's not nothing. That is the foundation of an argument." She leaned back. "But understand what you're fighting. They will not attack you as a bad father. That is a losing strategy, and they know it. They will construct a portrait of a man who opted out of professional life and has been living on his wife's income. They will make it sound caring. They will make you sound like a dependent. And a judge who hears that narrative without a compelling counter-narrative will find it credible." She held his gaze. "My job is to build the counter-narrative. And I need every single piece of paper you have, because sentiment does not survive a courtroom, Mr. Hargrove. Documentation does." Before he left her office, she gave him one instruction he hadn't expected. "Agree to the dissolution," she said. "Sign the paperwork ending the marriage. Don't contest the divorce itself. A man who fights to stay in a marriage that's over looks desperate to a judge. But custody, the assets, the platform. You concede nothing. You sign one line and you walk out, and you let them interpret that however they want. The best position you can be in, walking into what's coming, is underestimated." And so 2 weeks later, in a conference room with good light and expensive chairs, Miles signed his name to a single document, the consent to dissolve the marriage and nothing else. He held Maisie against his shoulder the way he always did, her fingers curled into his collar. He signed without argument and rose without ceremony, and carried his daughter out of the building into the gray afternoon. Fiona's attorney gathered the papers with a precise, satisfied efficiency. Fiona herself watched Miles go with the expression of a woman who had seen exactly the outcome she had prepared for. She had not yet discovered that she had been looking at the wrong column. The weeks that followed taught Miles something about how pressure is applied by people who know what they're doing. Fiona's side never raised its voice. It simply began to move in a dozen small directions at once. They requested a psychological evaluation, framed as routine. The language was careful and warm, and the implication was designed to do its damage quietly. A man who had stepped back from his career, who had made himself financially dependent, who spent his evenings alone in a room doing something no one could verify. Was he stable? Was he managing well? A judge would want to be certain. No one was suggesting anything. It was simply worth asking. Miles understood what the question was built to do. To answer it too strongly was to seem defensive. To comply without pushback was to grant it legitimacy. The trap was in the shape of the question itself. The visitation schedule deteriorated alongside. Pickups were rescheduled at the last hour for reasons that were always technically reasonable and never quite added up. A weekend was canceled because Maisie had a cold that Miles, when he called, could not actually hear in her voice. He could hear her asking when she could come to Dad's house. He could hear Fiona's voice in the background redirecting the conversation. He understood what was happening. She was teaching him, one cancellation at a time, what it was going to cost to keep going. She expected fatigue to do the work that argument couldn't. He did not tire. But he stopped sleeping well. The development that changed the shape of everything arrived on a Thursday afternoon when Beverly called him, in a tone that had shifted by a degree he had learned to pay attention to. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "did you know there's been acquisition interest in your platform?" He went completely still. "No, there is." She walked him through it. A Chicago-based infrastructure technology fund had been tracking his open repository for 6 months. The fund's principals had been discreet, but they had made contact through a firm that handled their initial due diligence, and the number they had floated in preliminary discussions was significant. 8 figures, preliminary, nothing signed. "Did you solicit this?" Beverly asked. "I put the core interface up as an open repository under my name to pressure test it," Miles said. "I never pitched it to anyone. I wasn't ready. I was going to finish the 3rd phase before I—" He stopped before he told Fiona. The irony of it arrived a half-second too late. Beverly was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had gone flat in a specific way he had come to understand meant she was thinking rather than reacting. "I want you to sit with something," she said. "I've been doing this work for 23 years, and I have learned to be very skeptical of convenient timing." She pulled up the dates, the filing, the early correspondence between Fiona's attorney and the legal department of the commercial real estate group that employed her. She laid them against the date the fund's initial interest could be traced back to. "Your wife's brother works in infrastructure finance," she said. Miles had forgotten about that. Patrick, Fiona's younger brother, 9 years out of Wharton, working at a fund that did exactly the kind of deals Beverly was describing. "I'm not telling you she knew," Beverly said. "I'm telling you the timeline doesn't fit an accidental sequence. She did not file slowly, out of genuine marital drift, and then get surprised when your work turned out to be valuable. She filed fast, faster than the failure of a quiet marriage requires. The petition to finalize was pressed early. If this asset surfaces publicly before the proceedings conclude, it has to be divided in the open with a judge watching. If she's out of the marriage before anyone outside their circle knows what you've been building, she controls the narrative entirely." Miles sat with that for a long time. He had spent weeks believing he understood the story. A father who had done the invisible work being managed out of his daughter's life by a woman with better resources. He had grieved that story in private. He had been, if he was honest, a little ashamed of the self-pity in it. But that was not the story. It had never been the story. Fiona had not left him because he had become someone she couldn't admire. She had left him because she had seen through her brother, or through her own attention, what was sitting in the 3rd bedroom, and she had moved quickly to make sure she was positioned correctly before anyone else could see it. He was not a husband being left. He was a holding being liquidated. The self-pity went out of him like air leaving a room and something else took its place. Not anger exactly, but a clarifying cold. "Okay," he said. "Yes," Beverly agreed. And that was all she said. The escalation came through a direction he hadn't predicted. Word began to move through the infrastructure investment circles. Nothing traceable, nothing he could point to in a document. Just a fog of doubt seated at the right cocktail parties and in the right inbox threads. Was the ownership structure of the platform clean? Was the founder in the middle of contested divorce proceedings? Had anyone looked at whether the asset might carry undisclosed encumbrances? A sophisticated fund would be prudent to pause. It was the same mechanism as the psychological evaluation, designed not to prove anything, but to generate a question that could not be answered quickly. Questions were enough to slow a deal, and a slowed deal was as useful to Fiona's position as a blocked one. Then she came to him in person. Miles had moved into a furnished apartment near the school, small and spare, a place built for transition. He was at the table one evening going through records for Beverly when the knock came. Fiona stood in the doorway looking composed and expensive and tired, in the specific way of someone who has been working very hard on something they cannot discuss. Miles stepped back to let her in because Maisie was asleep in the other room, and he would not have this conversation on the landing. She did not sit down. She looked around the apartment with an expression that was not contempt. Not quite. Something closer to a sorrow that Miles recognized as calculated. Then she made her offer. He would sign the settlement and a confidentiality agreement. He would take a structured cash payment and release all claim to the intellectual property. In exchange, she would lift the quiet pressure she had been applying to the acquisition conversations. The deal would proceed. Maisie's schedule would normalize. Everyone would walk away intact. "Miles," she said. Her voice was measured and almost kind. "You built something. I'm not trying to take that from you. But you've never been in a room like the one this deal is going to put you in. Let me handle the parts you don't know, and take what's fair, and be where you're actually needed." He looked at her for a long moment. The woman he had married when they were young and unguarded and genuinely certain about each other. He recognized in her the same person she had always been, clear-eyed and strategic and completely certain she was reading the room correctly. "Go home, Fiona," he said, and he opened the door. She held his gaze for one recalculating moment. Then she left. Her footsteps were even on the stairs, and the door pulled shut behind her without drama. Miles sat alone at the table in the sparse apartment and let the doubt arrive, because he was not the kind of man who could pretend it wasn't there. The question arrived the way honest questions do, in the dark, when there was nothing else to listen to. He was asking a 7-year-old to carry uncertainty through the machinery of a legal fight. The canceled weekends, the evaluations, the months of not knowing. Maisie did not understand all of it, but she felt it. Children feel the shape of things they cannot name. He sat with that for a long time. He did not reach a clean answer. He only had the promise and the work, and the choice not to stop. The story broke in the wrong direction 8 days before the hearing. A brief item appeared in a commercial construction trade publication, sourced anonymously, characterizing the acquisition interest in Miles's platform as complicated by contested IP ownership tied to ongoing divorce litigation. The framing was designed to sound like sober due diligence. The effect was immediate. The fund's representatives requested a pause in formal discussions pending clarification of the ownership structure. The same morning, Fiona's attorneys filed a motion to freeze all assets connected to the platform for the duration of the proceedings. Beverly called at noon. "If the freeze is granted," she said, "the deal stalls indefinitely. We'd be back where they wanted you in the beginning. A man with no verifiable assets contesting custody without leverage." Miles stood at the apartment window, looking at the parking lot below, the lot where Fiona's car had been parked the night she came to make her offer. "But I've also spent a week tracing the leak," Beverly said, and her voice had changed by that precise degree he had learned to listen for. The language in that article is very specific. The phrase contested IP ownership and the reference to the divorce proceedings. That combination appears in exactly one context outside of our correspondence. It was known to your wife, and it was known to one other person, a junior analyst at Patrick Fiona's brother's fund who left the firm 3 weeks ago and spent 4 days consulting independently before that item appeared. Miles was quiet. "The chain is traceable," Beverly said. "Not in a way they would have predicted traceable, but in a way that I can document. We bring this to the court and the motion to freeze collapses. An attempt to damage the asset they're claiming entitlement to is not a posture a judge will reward." "Then let's bring it," Miles said. He went to wake Maisie for dinner. He made pasta because it was what she asked for every time without fail, and they ate at the small table by the window. And she told him an elaborate story about something that had happened at recess, involving a misunderstanding about the rules of a game he didn't understand at all. He listened to every word of it. The morning of the hearing arrived with the particular neutrality of early fall in North Carolina, clean sky, air just beginning to turn. Miles had pressed his jacket the night before. made Maisie's breakfast, walked her to the neighbor who would keep her for the day, crouched down to fix the zipper on her backpack, and told her he'd be home by dinner. He stood at the curb outside the apartment building and waited because Beverly had told him only that someone would come and that he should not drive himself. He didn't ask why. The car that came was a dark blue Bentley, quiet and unhurried, and the man behind the wheel was Edmund Voss, whose name Miles knew from 12 years of reading industry, reports the way some people read box scores. Voss was the founding principal of the fund that had made the preliminary offer. He was 63, built like a man who had grown up doing physical work before he made money, and he got out of the car and came around the front himself to open the passenger door. "Get in," Voss said. "Beverly tells me you've been running this thing from a folding table in a spare bedroom. I want to hear it from you before I hear it from anyone else." Miles got in. They drove toward downtown Charlotte, in a silence that felt like Voss making a decision. And then he began to talk, and Miles answered, and by the time they were a few blocks from the courthouse, Voss had gone quiet again, with the quality of a man who had learned what he needed to know. He pulled to the curb, put the car in park, and turned to look at Miles directly. "When we first flagged your repository," Voss said, "my lead engineer told me the architecture was the most coherent thing he'd seen in a year from a single developer. Clean, underdocumented, clearly built by someone who wasn't thinking about the pitch. He said it looked like someone solving an actual problem." He studied Miles. "I've been in this business long enough to know that's not common." He got out of the car, walked around to Miles's side and held the driver's door open. "You drive the rest of the way," Voss said. "I'll come around as a passenger. Let whoever is watching from those steps see who got out of which seat." He allowed himself a brief, dry expression. "It won't hurt your case." Miles understood the geometry of what was being offered, the strategic kindness folded inside it. He slid behind the wheel. The car was quieter than anything he had ever driven. The courthouse steps were busy when the Bentley came around the corner and rolled to a stop in front of them. There were 2 journalists visible and a cluster of attorneys with the thick, organized presence of people who had filed a lot of motions. Fiona's lead attorney was halfway up the steps with a structured leather folder under one arm. Patrick, Fiona's brother, stood near the entrance with his hands in his pockets, wearing the careful expression of a man who has come to watch something finalize. The door opened and Miles Hargrove stepped out. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk. In the clear morning light, the man everyone in the original conference room had watched lose everything. The father with the duffel bag, the freelancer with no verifiable income, the dependent who should have been grateful for the weekends. He stood there unhurried and alone while Voss came around the passenger side and buttoned his jacket without comment. The journalist recognized the name before they recognized the face. The murmur traveled up the steps the way current travels, quietly, and then all at once. Patrick's expression shifted. Miles watched it happen, the arithmetic of a man recalculating the board he thought he had memorized, finding a piece on it he hadn't been told about. Miles didn't hold the look for long. He walked up the steps and through the doors and into a courtroom that had already decided the outcome and was about to discover it was wrong. Inside, Fiona's team led with the narrative Beverly had predicted, delivered with warm precision. A devoted father, yes. No one was questioning that. But a man who had voluntarily withdrawn from professional life, who had no stable documented income, who had relied on his wife's career for the financial stability their daughter had known. A mother offering continuity. A school district Maisie had always attended. A home she had always lived in. The argument was shaped not to wound but to reason, and its reason was almost airtight. Then Beverly stood. She did not raise her voice. She laid documents on the record the way a surveyor lays stakes, methodically and without drama. The timeline of the filing against the timeline of the acquisition interest, the early correspondence between Fiona's attorney and the firm's legal department, dates that predated any public knowledge of the platform's value by several months. The inference was not inflammatory. It was simply a sequence of events, and the sequence told its own story. She moved to the asset question. the inheritance from Miles's mother, received before the marriage and held entirely in a separate account. The receipts from that account, server costs, sensor equipment, licensing fees, every purchase documented to the source. The IP registration in Miles's name alone, filed in the first month of development. The timestamp logs of the work, 37 months of sessions, occurring consistently after 9 in the evening, after a household had gone to sleep, outside any hour that a court would characterize as shared marital time. This was not built with marital funds, Beverly said. It was not built during marital time. The intellectual property was registered to the petitioner's spouse alone, using funds that predate the marriage and were never commingled. The motion to freeze these assets is a motion to capture property the petitioner has no standing to claim. She sat down. The room was very quiet. Then Beverly produced the trace on the leak, the junior analyst, the timeline of his departure, and the brief independent consulting window before the article appeared. The specific language in the article and its match to language that existed in a limited number of documents. She laid it down step by documented step. The disruption of the acquisition negotiations was not the result of market caution, Beverly said. It was manufactured. The timing, the language, and the source of that information traced to a party acting in coordination with the petitioner. The court should weigh that accordingly when considering the petitioner's posture throughout these proceedings. In the hallway visible through the narrow window in the door, Miles caught a glimpse of Patrick moving away from the entrance without looking back. Walking in the direction of the elevators, he did not return. The judge allowed both sides their final arguments. Then he set the filings aside and looked at Miles the way a person looks when they've heard enough law and want to hear something else. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, "set aside the financial question for a moment. Tell me why you are here today, not what the record establishes. What you would say yourself." Miles stood. He did not reach for the platform or the timestamps or the fund with its 8-figure interest. "A few weeks ago," he said, "my daughter woke up in the middle of the night and came to find me, and she asked me if I was always going to be here, even when she got bigger." His voice was steady. "She's 7. She wasn't asking about any of this, but I've thought about that question every day since. Everything I've done, the work in that room, staying in the fight when it would have been easier to sign and walk away, all of it has been because I made her a promise that I would be there. I don't want primary custody because of what I built. I want it because I have been there every day for her entire life, and I will not be the reason the answer to her question becomes no." The room stayed quiet for a moment after he sat down. The judge made a note. Then he spoke. The motion to freeze the assets was denied. The acquisition, the court found, had no cause for obstruction and could proceed. On the question of custody, primary custody was awarded to Miles, with a defined and regular schedule for Fiona. The platform was ruled separate property, developed with separate funds, outside marital time, registered in the respondent's name alone. Fiona would receive her equitable share of the genuine marital estate and nothing beyond it. Miles watched his ex-wife receive this across the room. She was composed, as she always was. The only sign was a stillness in her face, a careful blankness where the ease used to live. Outside on the courthouse steps, Edmund Voss was standing with his hands in his pockets looking at the street below. "You want to know what I was actually testing this morning?" Voss said, when Miles came through the doors. "It wasn't the code. I resolved the code question months ago." He looked at Miles directly. "I wanted to see how someone carries themselves when the weight is real. You can't know that from a repository." He extended his hand. "We'll finish the paperwork next week. Welcome in, Mr. Hargrove." The deal closed on a Thursday. Miles did not mark the occasion with anything particular. He was in the carpool line when his attorney called to confirm. And he said thank you, and he turned down the radio, and he waited for the doors of the school to open. What he did with the first real money was buy a house 20 minutes from the school. Not large, not a statement, a craftsman with a porch and a yard that needed clearing, and a third bedroom that Maisie immediately identified as her art room. It was hers, and it was his, and that was the whole of what it needed to be. That first evening in the house, he made dinner the way he always had. Pasta, because it was what Maisie asked for without fail. And they ate at a table that was still the wrong size for the dining room and would need to be replaced, and neither of them cared. He helped her glue something to a piece of cardboard that was becoming, she explained to him at length, a diorama of an ocean floor that she was inventing the species for. He found the right stuffed animal and installed it in the correct position on the correct shelf. He turned out the light. He carried a cup of coffee out to the porch and sat in the dark and let himself feel, without apology, the specific weight of having kept his word. It was not triumph. It was not the satisfaction of having beaten anyone. It was the quieter thing that comes when you are still standing in the place you promised to stand. And the reason you promised to stand there is asleep inside. And the night is ordinary, and ordinary is what you were fighting for all along. He saw Fiona once, about 2 months after the closing, at a school event in the gymnasium. She was composed as ever. There was something around her eyes that had not been there before, a fatigue that composure could not entirely account for. He had heard that whatever had existed between her and her brother since the hearing was not what it had been. They exchanged a few civil sentences near the back wall. Maisie's spring recital, a schedule adjustment, the field trip permission form that needed 2 signatures. Fiona turned to go and then stopped. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. "I didn't know how far along it was," she said, quietly, almost to herself. "The platform, I knew something was there, but I didn't know what it was." Miles considered her for a moment. There were things he could have said. A version of himself from 8 months ago might have wanted to say them. "I know," he said. She nodded once and left. He crossed the gymnasium to where Maisie was waiting, already reaching for his hand, already pulling him toward the door, and whatever came next, the way children do, forward and without looking back, toward the ordinary, extraordinary dark and everything still ahead.